When we talk about turning points in history, moments when the course of entire civilizations hung in the balance, the year 1683 is one of those moments. Imagine standing on the walls of Vienna in September of that year. Before you stretches one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, tents spread across the horizon, banners fluttering in the wind, the thunder of drums carrying through the valley. The Ottoman Empire, under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, had come with one goal: to break Vienna and push into the heart of Europe. At first glance, the odds seemed hopeless. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Yet this story isn't just about military numbers. It's about courage, strategy, and unlikely alliances. It's about a desperate defense that would lead to one of the most dramatic rescue operations in European history, and ultimately a battle that decided the future of a continent. To understand how things reached this point, we need to step back. The Ottoman Empire had been Europe's looming threat for centuries. From the capture of Constantinople in 1453 to their dominance across the Balkans, they were a power few dared to challenge. By the late 17th century, the Ottomans had their eyes on Vienna once again. The city had already endured a brutal siege back in 1529, barely holding out. This time, however, the Ottoman High Command believed the stars had aligned for a decisive victory. Vienna wasn't just any city. It was the gateway to Central Europe, a fortress that guarded the Danube. Whoever controlled it could project power across the continent. For the Ottomans, conquering Vienna meant opening the road to Germany, Poland, and beyond. For Europe, losing it meant possible collapse. In early 1683, whispers of war began circulating. Merchants along the Danube brought tales of armies gathering in the east. At first, many dismissed these as exaggerated stories meant to stir panic. After all, Europe had been through centuries of conflict, and rumors of Ottoman invasions were nothing new. But then came hard evidence. Villages abandoned overnight, churches set ablaze, refugees streaming westward with stories of massive Ottoman forces on the move. By June, there was no denying it, the Ottomans were marching directly toward Vienna. Contemporary estimates placed the Ottoman army at around 150,000 soldiers. Later writers, eager to emphasize the drama, inflated that figure to nearly 300,000. Whether accurate or not, the sheer scale was terrifying. This wasn't just a raid. This was a full-scale attempt to redraw the map of Europe. Inside Vienna, the mood was grim but determined. The city was commanded by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a seasoned Austrian officer who understood the stakes. Starhemberg had only about 15,000 defenders, soldiers, militia, and volunteers to hold the city. That meant each man would face 10 enemies or more. Supplies were limited, walls were old, and morale was shaky. Still, Starhemberg ordered the city fortified. Civilians were mobilized to carry stones, dig trenches, and build barricades. Cannons were positioned along the ramparts. Women and children prepared food and water for the soldiers. Everyone understood that surrender was not an option. In July 1683, the Ottoman army arrived and encircled Vienna. The siege had begun. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was a man of ambition. Unlike previous Ottoman commanders who often focused on quick strikes, Kara Mustafa envisioned Vienna not just as a military conquest, but as a jewel of the empire. He wanted to capture it intact without destroying its wealth or grandeur. That meant avoiding massive bombardments that could ruin the city. Instead, he relied on a more patient, methodical approach, digging trenches, setting up siege artillery, and undermining the city's walls with explosives. But patience was a dangerous gamble. Every day the siege dragged on, there was the chance of European reinforcements arriving. Still, Kara Mustafa believed his overwhelming numbers would guarantee victory. Life inside Vienna turned into a nightmare. Food supplies dwindled quickly. Bread became scarce, meat almost non-existent. Disease spread as clean water ran out. The constant thunder of Ottoman cannons shook the walls and rattled the nerves of defenders. Yet there was also resilience. Starhemberg pushed his men to hold the line, reminding them of what was at stake. Letters smuggled out of the city begged for help, carried by daring riders who slipped through Ottoman lines at night. The defenders knew reinforcements might come, but they didn't know if they would arrive in time. Meanwhile, outside the city, Europe stirred. News of Vienna's plight spread quickly. For centuries, rivalries between European powers had kept them divided. But now, faced with the possibility of Ottoman domination, alliances began to form. At the center of this coalition was King John III Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski was already a legend, a warrior king who had fought countless battles against the Ottomans and Tatars. When he received the call for help, he rallied his army without hesitation. Sobieski's forces, combined with troops from the Holy Roman Empire and other allies, formed a coalition of roughly 70,000 men. It was still smaller than the Ottoman host, but it carried something the defenders of Vienna desperately needed: hope. By early September, Vienna was on the brink of collapse. Ottoman sappers had tunneled beneath the walls and set charges, causing massive explosions that opened dangerous breaches. Soldiers rushed to fill gaps with rubble and timber. Every assault was repelled, but just barely. Inside the city, desperation set in. Starhemberg knew they could not hold much longer. If help didn't arrive soon, Vienna would fall. And then on the morning of September 12th, 1683, hope appeared on the hills surrounding the city. Sobieski and his coalition army had arrived. The arrival of Sobieski's forces set the stage for one of the most dramatic battles in history, the Battle of Vienna. It wasn't just an army clashing against another, it was the fate of Europe being decided in a single day. But that is a story for the next part. The sight of the coalition army arriving on the hills was nothing short of miraculous for the people inside Vienna. Exhausted defenders climbed the battered walls, straining their eyes toward the horizon. Dust clouds rose in the distance, and beneath them shimmered the banners of Poland, Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, and many other states. At their head was King John III Sobieski, the warrior monarch who had marched his men hundreds of miles to arrive at this very moment. The news spread like fire through the city. Reinforcements had come. The defenders, who had been fighting on empty stomachs and sheer willpower, now felt the flicker of hope return. Sobieski knew exactly what was at stake. He was not a man to hesitate in the face of danger, and he understood that waiting too long could allow Vienna to collapse before his army even struck. But he also knew the Ottomans had a massive force entrenched around the city. Kara Mustafa had built an elaborate network of trenches, siege works, and fortified camps. To take them head-on would require precision, courage, and a gamble of the highest order. Sobieski's plan was clear. He would coordinate with the city's defenders, strike the Ottoman lines, and at the decisive moment, unleash one of the most powerful cavalry charges in history. On the morning of September 12th, 1683, the coalition army assembled. Roughly 70,000 men stood ready to march, while the Ottomans still outnumbered them with perhaps twice that number. Yet morale was everything. The coalition troops were fresh, rested, and united by a sense of destiny. The Ottomans, by contrast, had been engaged in a long and draining siege, their confidence high, but their lines stretched. As dawn broke, Sobieski sent his men forward. The coalition advanced in waves with German and Austrian infantry pushing against the Ottoman flanks, while Polish forces prepared to strike at the center. From the walls of Vienna, the defenders surged out, eager to join the fight and relieve the pressure that had nearly crushed them for 2 months. The battle was underway, and the roar of cannons, muskets, and war cries echoed across the valley. Kara Mustafa underestimated the determination of the coalition. He had believed his trenches and numbers would hold, but the European assault was relentless. Wave after wave of infantry clashed with the Ottoman soldiers, fighting hand to hand in the dust and blood. For hours, the battle raged, with neither side giving way. The defenders of Vienna weakened as they threw themselves into the fray, driven by desperation and the sight of their rescuers at last standing beside them. By the afternoon, the coalition had gained significant ground, but the Ottomans remained formidable. Kara Mustafa held his strongest forces in reserve, confident that he could still crush Sobieski's advance. Yet as the day wore on, the balance shifted. The Ottomans were being pushed back, their once carefully organized siege works collapsing under the weight of the assault. Morale began to falter, and that was when Sobieski made his move. From the wooded hills overlooking the battlefield, the Polish king gathered his famed cavalry, the winged hussars. These were not ordinary horsemen. They were among the most feared cavalry in Europe, known for their heavy armor lances and the iconic wings attached to their backs that roared like thunder when they charged. Sobieski had kept them waiting, conserving their strength for the perfect moment. Now, as the Ottoman lines wavered, he unleashed them. It was late in the day, the sun casting long shadows over the battlefield, when the thunder of hoofs began. thousands of cavalry, led by Sobieski himself, thundered down the slopes in one of the largest cavalry charges ever recorded. The ground shook beneath them, the sound like a rolling storm. To the Ottomans exhausted from hours of combat, the sight was terrifying. Armored riders sweeping down with unstoppable momentum. The charge smashed into the Ottoman center like a hammer on glass. Tired infantry broke under the impact, ranks shattered and panic spread. Kara Mustafa's once proud army, which had surrounded Vienna with confidence just weeks before, now found itself in chaos. Soldiers fled in all directions, some attempting to rally, but most overwhelmed by the ferocity of the attack. Sobieski and his hussars drove straight through, cutting deep into the Ottoman lines and throwing the enemy into full retreat. Inside Vienna, the defenders erupted in cheers as they saw the tide turn. The city that had been on the brink of collapse was saved in a single decisive strike. By nightfall, the Ottoman army was in disarray, abandoning their camps, their artillery, and their ambitions. The siege was broken. The battle was over, but its significance was only beginning to sink in. The victory at Vienna was more than just a relief for the city, it was a turning point for all of Europe. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the unstoppable force at Europe's doorstep. Now, for the first time in generations, that force had been decisively checked. Sobieski entered Vienna not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He was hailed as a hero, the man who had saved not only a city, but perhaps an entire civilization. His cavalry charge would become legend, a moment celebrated in art, song, and memory for centuries to come. Kara Mustafa, meanwhile, faced the fury of his own empire. The Sultan, furious at the failure, blamed him for the disaster. Ambition had turned into catastrophe, and within months, Kara Mustafa would be executed. The Ottoman dream of conquering Central Europe was shattered. The defenders of Vienna, who had endured starvation, disease, and near annihilation, now walked through the smoking remains of Ottoman camps, marveling at the treasure and supplies left behind. What had once been a nightmare siege became a story of resilience, alliance, and triumph. But beyond the battlefield, the consequences were profound. The victory at Vienna marked the beginning of the long decline of Ottoman power in Europe. It also strengthened the idea of collective defense among European states, proving that unity could resist even the mightiest of enemies. For centuries afterward, the battle would be remembered as the moment Europe turned the tide. And yet the story doesn't end with victory alone. The aftermath of the siege reshaped politics, culture, and the balance of power. Vienna would rise again as a symbol of resilience. The Ottomans would never regain the momentum they had once enjoyed. And John III Sobieski, the king who charged at the head of his hussars, would remain immortalized as the savior of Vienna. This was more than a clash of armies. It was a battle of civilizations, a struggle for identity, and a reminder that history often turns on the courage of a few at the right moment. For the people of 1683, the outcome was survival. For us today, it is a story of how determination, unity, and bold action can change the course of history. The cannons had fallen silent. The battlefield littered with abandoned weapons, broken tents, and the smoldering remains of the once grand Ottoman camp. The Battle of Vienna was over, but the aftermath was only beginning. For the defenders who had endured weeks of hunger, exhaustion, and terror, the sudden stillness felt almost unreal. They wandered through the wreckage in disbelief, finding vast stores of food supplies and riches that the Ottoman army had left behind in its chaotic retreat. To the Viennese, who had been living on crumbs, the discovery of grain and livestock in the Ottoman camp felt like a miracle. John III Sobieski entered the city the following day. He was not a conqueror demanding tribute or territory. He was a rescuer, a monarch who had answered the desperate call of another nation. Crowds gathered to see him, their cheers mixing with tears of relief. Starhemberg and the exhausted defenders hailed him as the savior of Vienna. Sobieski himself was humble in victory, writing to Pope Innocent XII that I saw God conquered. Those words echoed across Europe, turning him into a legend not only in Poland, but throughout Christendom. The sheer scale of the Ottoman defeat stunned observers. Kara Mustafa's massive army, which had once stretched endlessly across the horizon, was gone in a matter of hours. Entire siege works abandoned artillery, left behind tents filled with luxuries and treasures. The Ottomans had believed Vienna would be theirs within days. Instead, their dream collapsed in a rout. The Grand Vizier fled with what remained of his forces, but his reputation was destroyed. Within months, he would be executed by order of the Sultan, a silken cord wrapped around his neck, a grim reminder of how failure was not tolerated in the Ottoman court. For Vienna, survival came at a heavy cost. The city was scarred, its walls shattered by bombardment, its people thinned by hunger and disease. But it had not fallen, and that fact alone transformed the siege into something more than a military event. It became a symbol. Across Europe, bells rang, sermons thundered from pulpits, and artists rushed to commemorate the moment. Paintings depicted Sobieski's charge, engravings showed the chaos in the Ottoman camp, and stories spread that turned the battle into myth. For many Europeans, it was proof that divine providence had saved them, that the line had held at the very edge of collapse. Yet the consequences went far beyond symbolism. The Ottoman defeat at Vienna marked the beginning of a long decline. For centuries, the empire had expanded relentlessly, pressing deeper into Europe. Now, for the first time, their momentum had been stopped cold. The loss shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Ottoman armies since the fall of Constantinople. From this point forward, their enemies would grow bolder, seizing the initiative. The Holy League, a coalition of Christian powers, would form in the years that followed, launching campaigns that pushed the Ottomans steadily back. For the Habsburgs, who had ruled Austria and much of Central Europe, the victory at Vienna became the cornerstone of their rising power. The city that had nearly fallen became instead the launching pad of an empire. Over the next decades, the Habsburg monarchy would expand its reach, reclaiming Hungary and other territories that had long been under Ottoman control. The balance of power in Europe shifted, and Vienna began to rise as a cultural and political center that would dominate the 18th and 19th centuries. But there was also a deeper layer to the story. The battle was not just Europe versus the Ottomans. It was also a lesson in unity. For decades, European states had been more interested in fighting each other than resisting outside threats. France, Spain, Austria, Poland all had their rivalries, their wars, their ambitions. Yet when Vienna was in danger, when the line seemed ready to break, something rare happened. Leaders set aside their differences long enough to unite. The coalition that marched under Sobieski was a fragile alliance, but it proved decisive. Without it, Vienna would almost certainly have fallen. Sobieski's role as leader of that coalition gave him immortal fame, but his personal story also added a human dimension to the legend. He had not simply commanded from the rear. He had ridden at the front of the cavalry charge, risking his life in the thick of battle. His winged hussars were not just soldiers. They were symbols of courage that electrified the battlefield. The sight of those armored riders with their wings streaming behind them became an image of hope, and even today, centuries later, they are remembered as one of the most iconic cavalry forces in history. Meanwhile, within the Ottoman Empire, the defeat at Vienna forced a reckoning. The Sultan blamed Kara Mustafa, but the truth was more complicated. The empire had stretched its resources to the limit. Logistical challenges, long supply lines, and the stubborn resilience of Vienna's defenders all combined to doom the siege. Kara Mustafa's refusal to launch a decisive bombardment in hopes of preserving the city's wealth also played a role. His ambition clouded his judgment, and by delaying, he allowed the coalition to arrive in time. It was not just a tactical failure, it was a failure of vision. The world beyond Europe also watched closely. To neighboring powers, the siege revealed that the Ottomans were not unstoppable. To Russia, which would soon expand southward, and to Persia, which eyed Ottoman territory to the east, this defeat opened new possibilities. The ripple effects of Vienna spread far beyond the battlefield. For the people who had lived through the siege, though the consequences were more immediate, families reunited after weeks of separation. Children emerged from hiding, markets reopened. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the grief. Thousands had died in the defense, and the scars of starvation and fear would linger for years. Yet the collective memory of survival bound the city together. Vienna would carry the pride of having stood at the gates of history and endured. Stories from survivors paint vivid pictures of those final days. One account describes women standing on the walls passing stones to soldiers as the Ottomans launched their last assaults. Another recalls priests giving blessings to the dying, urging them to hold out just a little longer until help arrived. These moments, often overlooked in the grand narratives of kings and generals, were the threads of endurance that held the city together. Without them, no army, however great, could have saved Vienna. The victory also reshaped how Europe saw itself. It reinforced the sense of a shared identity, a continent bound not only by politics, but by culture, faith, and survival. The Siege of Vienna became a rallying point, proof that unity in the face of overwhelming odds could prevail. Over time, the memory would be embellished, turned into legend, and woven into the story of Europe's rise. But beneath the myth lay the raw truth of exhaustion, courage, and sacrifice. In the end, the Battle of 1683 was not just about one city, one king, or one empire. It was about a moment when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of transformation. If Vienna had fallen, history might have looked very different. But it did not. The walls held, the coalition arrived, and John III Sobieski's charge turned the tide. From that moment, the Ottomans would never again be the unstoppable force they once were, and Europe would march into a new chapter of its history with Vienna at its heart. The story of Vienna's salvation did not end with the smoke clearing on the battlefield. The victory shaped the decades that followed, leaving echoes that can still be felt today. For the people who lived through it, the memory of that September day was carved deep into their lives, a reminder of how close they had come to destruction and how narrow the line between survival and annihilation had been. In the immediate aftermath, Vienna was a city both triumphant and broken. Its walls were cracked and blackened, its streets filled with rubble. Starving citizens stumbled through markets that had been empty for weeks, suddenly overflowing with the abandoned spoils of the Ottoman camp. There were grains, meats, livestock, silks, even exotic goods carried from far corners of the empire. For many, it was the first real meal in months. Children who had grown thin and weak clutched bread with tears in their eyes, as though they could scarcely believe the nightmare was over. The celebration was raw and emotional, but behind the relief lay the knowledge of how close the city had been to collapse. John III, Sobieski, hailed everywhere as a hero, took little time to bask in glory. He was a practical man who understood that unity and victory could dissolve just as quickly as it had formed in desperation. He returned to Poland not with treasure, but with the knowledge that his kingdom had played a pivotal role in saving Europe. For his people, it was a moment of pride that would echo in their national memory for centuries. His cavalry charge, the thunder of the winged hussars sweeping down the slopes, became a legend retold from one generation to the next. The Pope in Rome celebrated the victory as a miracle of faith. Bells rang across Christendom, sermons proclaimed that divine providence had intervened, and paintings began to circulate showing Sobieski as almost a biblical figure leading Christian armies against the infidel. It was a powerful image, one that shaped the way the battle was remembered. Yet beneath the religious rhetoric, the deeper truth remained. This had been a victory born not only of faith, but of grit, strategy, and the willingness of diverse peoples to stand together. For the Ottomans, the defeat was devastating. The empire was vast, its power still considerable. But something fundamental had been lost at Vienna, the aura of inevitability. For centuries, their armies had seemed unstoppable, their campaigns rolling across continents with relentless momentum. After 1683, that momentum faltered. The Sultan punished Kara Mustafa with death, but no execution could erase the fact that the empire had reached its high-water mark. From then on, the Ottoman frontier would slowly, painfully recede. The Habsburgs, meanwhile, emerged stronger than ever. Vienna's survival became the cornerstone of their myth as defenders of Europe. Over the next decades, they would push the Ottomans back through Hungary, reclaiming territory that had been lost for more than a century. The Danube frontier shifted, and with it, the balance of power. The Habsburg dynasty, once on the defensive, now rose as one of the dominant forces of the continent. Vienna itself transformed, rebuilding not only its walls but its identity. What had been nearly destroyed would rise into a glittering cultural capital, a city of music, art, and politics that would define much of Europe's future. But as with all great victories, there were complexities. The unity that had saved Vienna was temporary. Old rivalries soon re-emerged. France, which had stayed aloof during the crisis, looked uneasily at the growing power of the Habsburgs. Polish hopes for lasting influence in European politics faded as internal struggles weakened Sobieski's kingdom. The Holy League that had formed would wage further wars against the Ottomans, but cooperation was never simple. The Battle of 1683 showed what was possible when unity prevailed, but it also revealed how rare and fragile that unity was. For the people who had lived and fought in Vienna, the memory of those days remained visceral. Survivors told their children of the nights when the walls shook with explosions, of the hunger that gnawed like a second enemy, of the moment when hope seemed gone until banners appeared on the hills. Ordinary citizens remembered carrying stones to the ramparts, fighting fires caused by bombardments, praying in churches filled with smoke. Their accounts remind us that history is not only the story of kings and generals, but also of nameless men and women who endured. Without their endurance, even Sobieski's great charge would have come too late. Over time, the siege of Vienna was woven into a larger story of Europe's identity. For some, it was remembered as the moment Christian Europe stood firm against the East. For others, it became a cautionary tale of what happens when divisions nearly doom a continent. And for many in Vienna, it was remembered simply as the time when death came to their very doorstep and was pushed back at the last possible moment. Looking back from our perspective today, it's tempting to see the battle as inevitable, as if history had to unfold this way. But standing on the walls in September 1683, nothing was certain. The defenders had no guarantee reinforcements would arrive. Sobieski had no certainty his charge would succeed. Kara Mustafa had every reason to believe victory was within his grasp. The outcome was decided not by fate, but by choices, risks, and moments of courage that tipped the balance. The Siege of Vienna remains one of history's great turning points because it reminds us of the thin margins on which civilizations pivot. A city nearly starved into surrender became instead a symbol of survival. An army that seemed destined to triumph crumbled in a single afternoon. A king who led his cavalry into the storm became immortal, and an empire that once seemed unstoppable began its long decline. When we remember Vienna 1683, we remember not only a battle but a crossroads. Had the city fallen, Europe might have taken an entirely different path, but it did not. The walls held. The charge came, and the story that unfolded became part of the foundation of the world we know today.